Hello, everybody.
Welcome in, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait a minute or two more to let everybody come in, come away from their other meetings they're in, the rest of their life, grab their coffee, etc. And then we'll get started. But thank you all for being on time and joining us. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good day, everybody, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Panama Bartholomy. I'm the Executive Director of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And welcome to our monthly webinar series, BDC Presents. And this month, we're very excited to be talking about neighborhood scale building decarbonization and how we can get to really aggregated approaches to high scale building decarbonization. We have a fantastic set of panelists for you, and I'm going to be your introductory to the webinar today. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So just a bit about us as folks come in. The Building Decarbonization Coalition, as the name suggests, we're a coalition of interested entities that work on really eliminating pollution from buildings, utilities, manufacturers, the rest of the supply chain, nonprofit organizations, government agencies. We try to bring everybody together to have a conversation and then be able to catalyze the change necessary to bring about the full elimination of pollution from our buildings for both global as well as local benefits. We have a fantastic monthly newsletter that goes out that gives a wonderful summary of everything that happened in the last month on the building decarbonization across the country and everything that's going to be happening over the next couple months in building decarbonization across the country, and welcome you to join our free newsletter, and also welcome you to be members. If you want to work with other organizations that are seeking to eliminate pollution from buildings, I welcome you to join our membership at the link that you see on the screen. Membership is free for the organization. Next slide, please. And I particularly today want to thank our Trailblazer members. Trailblazers are members that support our membership program with financial contributions that allows us to do things like this webinar series and the newsletters and other things that we do for our members. And so we very much appreciate our Trailblazer members that provide that financial assistance so that we're able to provide the overall informational assistance to the community. So thank you, Trailblazer members, and welcome to you today as well. Next slide, please. Some upcoming events you may be interested in. We have a monthly policy call in California where we go over everything happening legislatively, regulatorily, budget-wise at the state and the local level in California. It's a fantastic regular call. We also have a regular national call where we go around the country and we do a deep dive on states and what's happening in those individual states. On February 27th, we're going to be doing a deep dive in New Jersey. Some exciting stuff happening on building decarbonization in New Jersey, and we'd love for you to join us on February 27th. So please do register for that. Our next BDC Presents is going to be at the end of February, and we're going to be focusing on rate affordability. Obviously, one of the big leverage points for building electrification and building decarbonization is the affordability of electrification and making sure that we're leaving people better off from electrification rather than worse off. And so right-sizing rates, electric rates and gas rates are really critical for that journey. And so we're going to be having a deep dive on rate affordability on February 29th, and we'd welcome you to join us for that. We have some fantastic panelists lined up. And if after leaving this session, you just don't have enough on building neighborhood scale electrification, we and other groups are hosting an in-person summit in Albany at the Albany Capitol Center on March 6th. We're going to be having an in-person summit on New York's thermal energy networks. It's a fantastic opportunity if you're in the New York area or if you're in the Northeast to come together with other folks that are working on thermal energy networks, which we'll talk about today, and be able to have in-person off Zoom discussion with live human beings and really hear about some of the leadership that's being expressed in the Empire State in this area. Next slide, please. So just some logistics. Everyone's muted. We had just over 600 organizations register for this webinar, so we can't let everybody free range, but you are muted. If you do have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if you want to engage in the community chat, feel free in the chat to offer some comments. We've asked our presenters to respond when they're not speaking to some of the Q&A if they can, and if they can't, we'll address some of the questions at the very end. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be placed on the BDC website's resource library, just like all of our other BDC Presents videos that you all have access to. All of the registrants will be emailed a link. And also we provide summaries, written summaries of these webinars that we'll be sending out to you as well as the slide deck and the recording. So please do register, and please do check our resource library, not only for the link to this presentation, but the fantastic, amazing, deep set of resources that we have on building decarbonization on that library. All right, enough with the logistics. We've got over 300 people in, so let's get into this exciting panel. I'm going to speak for probably another 5 minutes or so, just provide some context for the conversation. And then we have just two amazing people today to talk about neighborhood scale electrification, neighborhood scale building decarbonization. Rachel Kuykendall, she's a principal strategic analyst at Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest utility in the United States, a mixed fuel utility. They provide both gas and electricity over Northern California. And I would say that Rachel is really one of the visionaries in our space right now. And the work that she's doing inside Pacific Gas and Electric around mapping and planning and analyzing and thinking through the market models of aggregated scaled building electrification is incredibly exciting. I leave every conversation with her just blown away by what she's working on in there and how she's leading that organization forward. She's going to be talking about really targeted or zonal electrification. I'm also then really pleased to have Jared Rodriguez from Emergent Urban Concepts, where he's a principal. Jared is one of the leading thinkers and doers, not just a thinker, but a doer on thermal energy networks and community-led approaches to aggregating building decarbonization. And so Jared's going to be talking about thermal energy networks today. And so we have two great speakers who are speaking about the two dominant models that are emerging around neighborhood building decarbonization. But before we do, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So back in November of last year, we released a new white paper on neighborhood scale building decarbonization. It was our goal to be able to start to provide some framing for this conversation that's happening across America, but really across many other countries as well, around ways to be taking more of a neighborhood approach to building decarbonization. And so we wanted to talk about all the terms that are being used, the methodologies, the framing, and in particular, what are some of the unanswered questions? This, as you'll see, provides, we think, a lot of benefits on this approach compared to our current approach to building decarbonization, but there's a lot of unanswered questions. And so we wanted to highlight those and really use the white paper as an easily accessible way to introduce people to the concepts, but also try to spur a whole bunch more conversations and research done by other organizations, either in partnership with us or on their own, to be able to get down to some of the answers to these questions. And so would welcome everybody to take a look at the white paper, to provide comments and reach out to us to work with us on some of the solutions that are identified in the white paper. Next slide, please. And so the reason that we're focusing on neighborhood scale is that obviously buildings make up a significant part of our greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally, it's about 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we're going to reach our goals on climate change, we're going to have to address buildings. Next slide, please. And so you have many states that are working on greenhouse gas measures, cap and trade measures, greenhouse gas targets, net zero energy by 2040X, 2030X, 2050X. It all depends on the state. And you also have many states that are working to clean up their grid. But there are very few states who are taking a particular approach to making sure that we're zeroing out the building sector. And so we need new and really effective and fast ways to be getting to scale on the building sector and starting to get our buildings over onto an increasingly cleaner electric grids for our sector. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of work to do there. We have just a lot of buildings. And it's going to potentially take a long time if we follow the current market model. And the vast majority of these buildings are single family buildings, which present some real challenges when we're thinking about how to reach scale and trying to get to net zero or zero emissions by 2050. We have 25 years roundabout, but a lot of buildings to go. And so we're going to have to figure out what are the market models, what are the policy levers we need to pull in order to be able to get all of these buildings to eliminate their pollution. Next slide, please. And so the current market model, we believe, doesn't lend itself very well to meeting those goals. The current market model is one that's based on replacing an appliance when it breaks about every 15 to 20 years for your furnace or your boiler, about every 10 to 15 years for your water heater, about every 20 years or so for your gas stove. And it relies upon a whole series of different market actors working with disparate levers that they're trying to pull and value propositions that they bring. And if we're going to be transitioning from one technology to another, say from a furnace or a boiler to a heat pump, it's requiring some level of interaction and engagement and understanding from the consumer in order to be able to make this shift, and really pushing quite often the supply chain to make the shift. And so there's a whole series of inefficiencies, inequities, and problems in expecting the current market model to be able to completely decarbonize the building stock by the time we're trying to completely eliminate pollution from buildings over the next 25 years. We have if we have 110 million buildings, you can guess that there's perhaps 500 million individual decisions on appliances to be made, and we're going to have to hope that the current market model gets that right every time to be able to eliminate pollution from buildings. And we believe that we need to be having stronger strategies than hope if we're going to meet our climate goals. Next slide, please. And so we believe not only for climate change, but also for equity and ratepayer protection, we're going to need a more coordinated, scaled, and managed transition. Not only are we relying upon customer choice, but an unmanaged approach to building decarbonization really likely leaves an inequitable future of the gas system where lower income families, renters, and industries that are hard to electrify are left on an increasingly expensive gas system. And from a ratepayer perspective, this is actually the most expensive way that we can decarbonize our buildings. And so we firmly believe that we need an adjacent market model. It's not that the current market model and the current approaches of plumbers and HVAC technicians will go away. They'll still be doing the vast majority of the work between now and 2050, we believe. But we need a backstop. We need a climate and equity backstop, an adjacent market model that can ensure we're actually going to meet our climate targets and do it in an equitable way to protect ratepayers and ensure good quality jobs in the process. And so we think a coordinated, scaled, and managed transition is needed in order for us to be able to meet our goals in all those areas. Next slide, please. And so we, after a lot of inquiry and thought and talking to a lot of stakeholders, really believe that we need more of a neighborhood scale approach to building decarbonization. We need strategies for transitioning entire communities and neighborhoods at a time and being able to really aggregate buildings together to be able to take buildings off of the natural gas system in a more of a neighborhood scale. You're able to get significant efficiencies of scale and purchases. You're able to use avoided costs of gas replacement lines at times. We think that there's a much better approach and a lot of benefits from looking at more of an aggregated approach on a neighborhood scale for building decarbonization to help us meet our goals. Next slide, please. Currently, we've identified in the white paper 2 primary pathways for achieving neighborhood decarbonization. I'll just briefly cover them. One is really relying upon the electric network, and one is looking at a new thermal energy network. So the electric network approach is what Rachel from Pacific Gas and Electric will be talking about. And this looks at taking whole neighborhoods off of the gas grid and putting them onto the electrical grid, replacing all of the appliances with electric appliances, making sure that the neighborhood is ready for those that increased load, and providing all of the support to building owners and occupants needed to be able to make this transition, and having the utility take a really big leadership role in this process. Next slide, please. The other major market model, and again, these are the market models that are emerging right now. This is not to say those will be the only ones, but the 2 that are really part of the heavy discourse right now that we'll be covering today is thermal energy networks and the opportunity to be really looking at interconnecting buildings on thermal energy loop, where you're taking pipes that are largely the same pipes that we use for the gas system right now. And instead of putting fossil fuels through them, we put moderately warmed or cooled water through, and are able to then plumb that to each individual building to be able to put it through a heat exchanger and use that for heating, cooling, potentially space water heating as well. This has particular benefits, as Jared will cover, in areas where it gets very cold in the United States and other countries, and to be able to manage peak demand in the winter from extreme heating climate areas. And Jared will talk about all the benefits of thermal energy networks in his presentation. Next slide, please. And so we would love for you to read the report, offer us any feedback, reach out to us to partner. We're going to be doing a number of things on follow-up to this. We're currently about to contract to be able to build out a model for thermal energy networks to really be able to look at technical feasibility and cost effectiveness and how to apply thermal energy networks within different areas of the country. And so we're excited about that, and we'll be doing continued work in this area on the policy, market transformation, and consumer education side. So please do check out our report and offer any comments. Next slide. And with that, I'm so excited to bring in Rachel, as you'll see, just a brilliant member of the building decarbonization community and at the forefront of this topic right now. And so we're excited to have Rachel in. Rachel, please take it away and tell us what's going on at Pacific Gas and Electric.
Happy to, and thanks all. Really appreciate this great group this morning. and finally made it in. So some fun tech issues this morning. As Panama mentioned, my name is Rachel Kuykendall. I am a strategic analyst on PG&E's decarbonization strategies team, which is a pretty fun team. So we actually take what we need to get to for our decarbonized 2045 energy systems and help the company think about how we get from where we are today to that net zero energy future. And for us, neighborhood decarb plays a big role in that. So next slide here. Just as a little bit of framing about PG&E and why this is such a critical component to some of the work we do. So PG&E does have a goal by 2040 to have a net zero energy system that's 5 years ahead of California. And when you look at sort of where PG&E's emissions come from, the majority of them come from our gas system. So this is really, I think, an issue that we have to face head on, and it's a tough issue as a gas utility. I think Panama alluded to this, but the way that gas systems are funded by ratepayers, they have a relatively fixed cost of maintaining the system that's spread over our customers and a number of firms. And as we have customers and usage depart the system, those dollars to maintain the system are spread over a smaller and smaller rate base, which increases rates. So, a lot of what we do in this space as a gas utility is to think through how can we both meet our carbon goals and really do it in a way that protects our most vulnerable populations from these large potential rate spikes. Next slide. And I wanted to level set here. I'm going to throw a couple terms out at the group. And this is really, I think, PG&E specific terms and how we think about this neighborhood scale electrification. We, I think, really draw a delineation between what we call targeted electrification and what we call zonal electrification. And for us, targeted is really, I think, some of the low-hanging fruit of doing this work. That's the electrification at the neighborhood scale that is motivated by a financial reason. So a really good example of this is, say we have a large investment in repairing a gas line. Can we look instead at electrifying those customers at a rate savings for our gas customers? We've done about 100 or so of these projects to date at PG&E. And so we have some really good, I think, initial learnings of what this looks like. I will note that in terms of the physicality of these projects, they tend right now for us to be on our transmission system, which is our high pressure system. And they tend to be like 1 or 2 customers at the most. And the reason for that we'll get into is as a gas utility, we do have an obligation to serve. So if we do have a customer that we approach for this potential savings and they say no, that sort of sinks our project. So these tend to be right now very, very small in scale. Zonal electrification or what we call zonal electrification at PG&E, on the other hand, is really the reverse. This is electrification, again, really geographically focused, that's looking at decommissioning gas lines. But it is motivated, I'd say, not solely by cost, although cost can certainly be a component. So this is things like, are there low-income neighborhoods that we'd like to potentially decommission before they're exposed to higher gas rates? Are there risky parts of our system that we'd like to decommission? Are there areas where we have high leakage that we can potentially decommission? And the scale of this is potentially much larger, but I would say this for us as a utility presents a particular challenge because these projects are really, really hard to fund for us under current sort of paradigm in California. Next slide, please. All right. I thought I would start with just sort of explaining where we are for targeted electrification to date and some of the challenges. So this project over here at the left is, I think, a really good example of what these projects tend to look like. And this was like it was 2 farms on the end of a line, and the gas line was running under a major freeway in California. So not only was there a very high cost of $1.2 million to repair this gas line, it also would have involved shutting down the freeway for about 6 months, which would have been not a great project to undertake. We instead, this got flagged by our gas team as potentially a viable project for electrification. The cost for doing the electrification came in just under $200K. We have some specialized end uses here for the farm that are quite unique, I would say. But that sort of delta between the 1.2 and the 200K then can go back to our gas ratepayers. So helping sort of mitigate this potential rise in gas rates that we are projecting. We fund these programs right now, again, at a small scale through our general rate case. So these are funded through that effort. We've done about 100 to date, and I'd say a couple of things that really I think are preventing us from getting to scale with this effort. The first, and I'm gonna go really knee deep for like 2 seconds into utility financing, which is I think everyone's favorite topic, right? When we do sort of the gas replacement, that is considered a capital spend for us as a utility. So what we're able to do is actually leverage outside capital and essentially make those dollars go further. We're also, when we treat a project as capital, able to recover the cost of that project over a longer time frame. So typically for like a gas pipeline repair, we recover that cost from our ratepayers over about 50 or 60 years. When we do the electrification right now, we are treating that as an expense from an accounting standpoint. And why that is particularly challenging is the first, so we can't actually spread those costs over that 50 or 60 year period. So what that looks like for our ratepayers is a really, really, really big spike in rates in year 1, which can be really challenging for doing this work at some significant scale. The other, and I think really more important part about this is because it's expense and not capital, we can't leverage those outside capital dollars. And what that means is for us, when we do these projects, the electrification has to be about 4 or 5 times cheaper than the capital gas repair for them to sort of get on financial parity for us as a utility. So this, I think, is a really easy win if for regulators across the US to sort of take a look at this distinction and get some creative financial treatment for how we think about these to really motivate gas utilities to do these projects. The second I mentioned is obligation to serve, which is the big elephant in the room. In California, we are thinking this is a legislative fix. But if you take sort of this case as an example, if one of these 2 customers said no, we would have had to spend this $1.2 million and shut down the freeway for 6 months. Even though it's sort of in the best interest of our planet, of our ratepayers to do these projects. So I think not only do we really need a legislative fix, but I think we really need to get better as a community about educating customers about the benefits of electric appliances so that we can get more buy-in from these customers. I think last but not least on this piece, on this slide, I will share we have filed, for those who are really interested in reading about 200 pages of testimony, utility testimony, really exciting. We did file an application for a project at CSU Monterey Bay that is sort of looking to make the case that we should be able to capitalize the electrification costs of doing these work. And it's about now 600 residential units, all owned by CSU Monterey Bay, that we'd be looking to electrify, the cost of which would be fully covered by that avoided spend in repairing the gas line. So if you are really interested in some riveting reading, that is a sort of, I think, cutting edge utility project to potentially look at. Next slide here. All right, Panama, I included this one for you. So I frequently get asked, what is the scale of this targeted electrification thing? How much are we talking replacing the whole gas system? So we've done some work with E3 to look at, the scale and scope of cost-effective building electrification as an alternative to our capital spends. And what this is showing here, I'll go sort of top down. It looks at the total miles in our gas system, which is about 43,000 for PG&E. What we then look at in this model that we did with E3 is how much of that would be scheduled for replacement, typically through our pipeline replacement programs between now and 2045. And that gets us to about 4,500 miles of pipe that we would traditionally replace. We then did some modeling to look at how much of that would be what's called hydraulically feasible to decommission, which essentially means we can remove that pipe without affecting upstream and downstream customers. And then finally, how much of that would be cost effective to do the electrification instead of the pipeline replacement. And then really, I think the outcome of this for us as a utility, and we'll maybe share a link to this. E3 has a whole white paper on this that they published, which is really nerdy and great. But for us, I think the takeaway is cost effectiveness is not the limiting factor to doing this work. It's really the limiting factor is how much of this pipe are we already sort of putting in our rate base. The takeaway for us is everything that we would be looking at for replacement, we essentially should be looking at to electrify because it's pretty darn cost effective to do so, which I think is a really new concept for gas utilities. But this is, I think, really to do this work, the low hanging fruit. Next slide. All right, I am getting a warning that I only have a few minutes left here, so I'm going to breeze through zonal electrification and what we're really doing here. I think what is kind of fun that we are working on here at PG&E, and I'm a total nerd for saying this is fun, but we've developed what we call our geospatial electrification tool. That looks at, it's actually a GIS-based tool. It looks at about 100 different data points to quantify which areas of our gas system may be ripe for potential electrification. So we look at things like the age of our pipes, where we have disadvantaged communities, the riskiness of our pipes, pipe material. We quantify all of those, and we actually report 4 numerical scores for each pipe segment. So we look at, is it cost effective to replace? Is there an equity benefit for replacing that pipe? Is there a risk benefit? And is there a GHG benefit? So right now, this is an internal tool that we use mainly for our teams, and we have a few cities under NDA that have actually can get in here and look at their specific city or county to identify, what the gas system looks like, where there's upcoming work, etc. We're working really hard actually to make a more public facing version of this tool, obviously with a little bit less of the juicy data that underlies it, but really to help point folks in these communities to potentially neighborhoods where we're very interested as a gas utility about potentially looking at electrification. And then last but not least, what I would say is, again, sort of something fun and exciting that we're doing. We have a pilot in our energy efficiency portfolio that's called our Zonal Electrification Equity Program. And that's looking at essentially what we did is we pulled every single gas project that is in a disadvantaged community, regardless of the costs of both the gas work and the electrification. And we've handed those to our implementers for this program and have asked them, okay, how do we do this at a scale? So getting beyond maybe the onesie twosies that we traditionally look at in target electrification to really get into these communities in really a meaningful way. So I will end there and just thank you all for the great questions I've seen coming in through the chat. My contact information is in the slides if you want to reach out.
Thank you, Rachel. I think everyone just saw how, you could just spend days listening to Rachel and everything that she's working on at PG&E and everything PG&E is working on, and just the exciting leadership that they're expressing in this area. Everything from the financial models to the utility business models to the project costs to the different tools they're developing. And one of the things we're finding out across America is that a lot of the gas utilities across the United States don't have the kind of mapping tools and the mapping capabilities that Rachel just exposed us to. So a ton of really great work. And thank you, Rachel, for being inside the belly of the beast and working on that and moving the utility in that direction. So that was the electric network approach to neighborhood scale electrification. We're going to go over to thermal energy networks right now. And when you think about like the handful of people in the United States to talk about thermal energy networks, Jared's going to be one of those handful of people that you'd want to have at your dinner party to talk about thermal energy networks. And so we're really excited to have Jared here from Emergent Urban Concepts. They're a consultant to the BDC in New York and just doing fantastic work with us and on this topic for others around the country. And so Jared's here to talk about the exciting news on thermal energy networks, where they're at and where they're going and what we can expect and how we can dig in. So Jared, please take it away.
Wow. Okay. So the chat is blowing up. The Q&A is blowing up. This topic is massive, absolutely huge. And so, I think I want to zoom out and hit on some critical themes here, because if you approach the neighborhood scale without really understanding all the various needs of a community, you're probably going to fail. Right. So you can go out at this like a regulated utility. We sort of heard that approach and that perspective. Or you could go at this more like a political organizer or someone that does economic development or someone that does urban planning, which is sort of the perspective that I'd like to bring to the table. So we need holistic approaches. We need more generalists in this space. And yeah, next slide. Let's go into it. So we need to network, right? We're here talking about heat, but we also need to network people, plans, and heat. And if we don't do that, we're going to have projects that occur in a vacuum, and they will not serve everyone, and they will not serve all of our objectives. So let's go on to the next. So strategic decarbonization planning in general, this could be at the building scale, at the neighborhood scale, the block level, in large social housing complexes or 1 million square foot Class A office buildings. It always requires balancing multiple goals and embracing a multitude of approaches. and translating language into a pattern of language that all stakeholders can understand, whether it's a finance person or a mechanical engineer or a building owner or a tenant or a resident. I'm not going to get into the depths of this slide, but this is just showing all the various critical issues that need to be brought to the table for a discussion when you're coming up with a decarb plan for a building in particular. Next slide. And then forming a coalition or a consortium on a community level at the neighborhood scale is absolutely necessary, right? We only get things done when we create coalitions. I mean, what are we doing right here? And so we have to bring community voice to the table. We have to make data public. This is in the chat. I'm just watching the chat. My chat's blowing up. We have to involve the workforce from the very beginning, get them involved in legislation, local, state, at all levels of government. And we need to make analysis and design approaches open and understandable by the public. So this is very difficult, right? This is not easy, but we're finding ways to do this. So we'll go to the next slide. I think everyone too needs to understand that heat is a precious resource. What is electricity? You know, actually it's a transformation of heat. Heat is the fundamental, and just, you know, energy in general, right? That's the fundamental resource that we're here to talk about, okay? So if it's a precious resource, why do we do things like cool buildings and then throw that heat away? Why do we do things like run a data center in the winter next to affordable housing or social housing and then just throw that heat away, right? These activities are totally unacceptable, but we accept them because we don't know that it's happening. Next slide, please. And so this is sort of a framework that I use. I helped develop this with Rocky Mountain Institute and New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, among a few other super awesome consultants that work with NYSERDA. And I think we all realize that the public in general and the industry doesn't have a simple framework to understand how to approach decarbonization in buildings or neighborhoods or cities. And this is the result of that. And it's very simple, right? We can't make a plan without knowing what the building is, okay? Or without knowing what the neighborhood is. So what equipment's in the building? How does heat move? When is heat consumed? How much power is being consumed at the peak, right? We need to know our buildings before we can come up with a plan, or we need to know our neighborhoods before we can come up with a plan. And just because we're electrifying doesn't mean that we can just, you know, throw everything at the wall and forget energy efficiency. So we have to reduce consumption. We're not going to do this if we don't reduce consumption of power, of heat, et cetera. And this issue about heat recovery, I think, is one of the biggest, most critical issues that are out there that we just tend to just continue ignoring for whatever reason, because I think it's something that's not visible, right? You can't really see heat. So we willingly throw it away. And then this phased approach to electrification is very important, especially in very complex urban environments and in large buildings, right? In smaller, simple buildings, we can do it in one full swoop. In large, complex buildings where there are many tenants, in very urbanized environments, at different scales, we have to take a stepwise approach to getting this done. So next slide, please. So all paths to resource efficient decarbonization and decarbonization of cities in general require heat recovery. Okay, we cannot keep doing this. We have to think about how we're going to capture the heat that we're throwing away and get it back in buildings when and where we need that heat. Okay, so across time and across space. For those who didn't know, cooling produces heat, right? It's the opposite of heating. Cooling produces heat. Anytime we're cooling, we're moving heat away. And anytime we're heating, we're moving heat toward. Heat goes down the drain. We heat up all of this water so that we can take a shower. It passes by our body in less than a couple seconds. It goes down the drain and into the sewer and onto the wastewater treatment plant, hopefully. Think twice about ventilation, especially when we're in cold climates, right? We ventilate our kitchens and our bathrooms, our office buildings, and we just blow all that conditioned air, whether it's cooled and dehumidified or it's heating, we're just blowing it right out the roof into the air. It really makes no sense. So we have to be thinking twice about ventilation and how we can incorporate heat recovery there, and then save it for later. So incorporating thermal storage to whatever extent we can, and thinking about thermal storage before we think about battery electric storage is absolutely critical if we're trying to contain the cost of decarbonization in general and across the economy. So next slide, please. So neighborhoods offer different thermal energy resources, right? Every neighborhood, every community is different. We can't say that they're all the same and that the approach is going to be exactly the same in every block, right? Every block is different. There's a variety of thermal energy resources and waste heat sources that are available on each block, right? In each community, in every downtown, that could be tapped and stored and moved appropriately so that we aren't stressing the electric grid, right? So that we don't have to overbuild it in the way that we're typically used to discussing. If it's going to cost $1 billion, for example, in part of Manhattan, to demolish part of Manhattan, to add a new substation so that we can electrify buildings, maybe there's a better way. I'm not saying that that's the same, that's the example that would arrive everywhere, but that's an extreme example. Maybe there's a better way. And so TENs are needed, or thermal energy networks are needed to complete resource efficient decarbonization and achieve that goal by storing, capturing, moving heat to where and when it's needed. Next slide, please. So playing matchmaker is also super critical, right? This is really important. First and foremost, you need to define or determine who can play that matchmaker in any particular community. Is it the utility? Is it local government? Is it an organizer? Is it an organization? Who is it? Who can help do that, right? Can we create a coalition that does this so that we're identifying where those thermal pairs are, where a network might begin, and then how it can expand over time in order to achieve these bigger goals of how do we avoid making massive investments in our infrastructure system? How do we accelerate decarbonization with an equity lens? And how do we bring decarbonization more into a conversation around economic development than a conversation about new cost, right? Or a cost that wasn't expected, right? We're sort of starting in not a great place. We're having to convince people that this is a difficult thing to do and that we need to sacrifice. That's not what this is, right? This is an opportunity to position your downtown, for example, to compete in the 21st century and to potentially have lower operating costs than it would otherwise have. So that we have to reframe and use narratives to get people to think differently about this issue. Next slide. So just to go back to coalition members, right? They can include anybody, right? No one's not invited to the table here. It can be anyone. And every community is different. So start with whomever has a predominant voice in the community, whoever might be underrepresented, bring them to the table and start teaching them about this and talking about this approach. State and policy, local regulators, policymakers, right? I'm not going to read everything here, but you know this, right? This is how we get everything done, is we create a coalition, we bring people that have different ideas and different training together to find solutions. Next slide. And what are the next steps, right? So form your coalition, create a team in your community, in your neighborhood, identify what expertise you want to bring on board, identify the developer. In certain states, that could be the utility, the regulated utility, or it could be the municipality. Identify any other third parties that have to get brought to the table that can make this happen. And then start identifying where your thermal energy resources are, and then figure out where your electric grid constraints are, and then figure out what's in the building so that you can start that transition plan. And so having the transition plan is absolutely critical, and having everybody sort of on the same page in the same way that we do urban planning is just totally necessary to advance these steps and next steps. Next slide, please. And that's it. I mean, it was super high level. It seems very easy. It's not. And happy to get into some questions.
Thank you, Jared, so much. It's, I think, incredibly exciting. We are seeing legislation in just about 10 different states right now on thermal energy networks being introduced across the country. So this is a concept that's really taking hold. It has some real political saliency, as you can imagine, particularly for gas utilities and the workers within the gas industry. You know, a lot of this work looks the same to them, and the opportunity for them to be able to be doing similar work while decarbonizing our building sector and our communities has some real attractiveness to them. So thank you for that, Jared, and thank you, Rachel. We have one or two questions that have come up in the chat, in the Q&A. Rachel, I'm going to turn the first one over to you. There's so many to choose from, but one of the things that's come up is a question about what about non-mixed fuel utilities? And so I know that you're talking to gas utilities across the United States. And so you've explained your situation from a mixed fuel utility. When you're talking to some of your colleagues at the gas utilities that are interested in this, you don't have to name names. What are you hearing from them about what they're seeing as their opportunities to be able to work on neighborhood scale or targeted or zonal electrification?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think in some ways, as a dual fuel utility, I think we have it a little bit easier because we have access to data on both sides of the system. And we have both of those customers. I will say our peers in the gas industry, I think, similarly seem to be coalescing around the idea of looking at big investments in the gas system as a starting point. I think they too see rising gas rates as a real challenge that electrification can help with. I will say, I think also there's some interest in exploring geographically, like the ends of their system and working in. That seems to be a very popular concept for some of our gas-only utilities. So taking really small bites of the apple, as it were, to get started. But I have been encouraged, I would say, about just the sheer number of conversations that are happening in this space today that frankly weren't a year ago. So I think everyone's in the same boat of trying to figure this out.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jared, you mentioned earlier leadership happening in New York and Massachusetts on thermal energy networks. Could you speak a little bit to that, like what you're seeing and what that leadership looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did see a question that came up that asked whether or not thermal energy networks can happen or whether or not they can be built in California. They can be built everywhere, and they already exist everywhere. And we could talk about what that means. But in Massachusetts, and in New York, effectively what's happening is a regulatory proceeding. In Massachusetts, this is not on the heels of legislation, I believe. This is more on the heels of regulatory efforts to modify how utilities function and how they behave, right? Because utilities don't, people like to be angry at utilities. utilities are an animal that were fabricated by society. Okay, they have laws that govern how they act, how they behave, who they interact with, and how. We have full control over that. And in some ways, we have control through regulatory proceedings, and in other ways, we have control through policy and new legislation. So I can speak more about New York. The big shakeup in New York was policy, and it was the Utility Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act. UTENJA effectively redefined what a utility was by going right into the public service law and literally modifying some definitions. So previously, gas companies were gas companies, meaning they could only move gas. Electric companies were electric companies, and they could only move electric. Now, they're also thermal companies, and they can move heat. How do they move heat? Well, we're in a regulatory proceeding to determine exactly how. And we're doing definitions around thermal energy networks and some of the other terms that you've heard today. And we're sitting in 6-hour meetings with the Public Service Commission and the industry and utilities to determine the definition of particular words that we thought were already defined. So it's really, really super interesting what's happening in the Northeast. And then on the heels of this process, there are dozens of projects that are being developed. Some are being built. So pay attention to this, because this is today, it's happening now, but it's also the future, I believe, for every state in this country and for every country in the world, to be honest with you. And we can get into how do thermal energy networks already exist in every state, but don't want to take up too much time.
Fantastic, Jared. We have time for one more question. There's obviously a lot more questions that haven't been answered. And so, as we said earlier, those of you that have registered for this webinar will be getting an email next week that has a link to the recording, as well as answers to unanswered questions that we're able to provide and notes that are being taken by BDC staff for this. So please do register for this webinar if you're not registered. And these unanswered questions, we're going to seek to answer them and get them back out to you. But I also highly recommend reaching out to these presenters and not overwhelming them, but engaging with them for some of the answers to the questions. Rachel, I got a twofer for you. There's a question about obligation to serve, and just wondering, is the obligation to serve entirely at the discretion of the customer, or is it based on a menu of services offered by the utility? Second question is, could you say a little bit more about your GIS tool and the arrangements that you have with local governments, and are there opportunities for non-governmental organizations or community groups to engage with you to learn more about their neighborhoods as well from the tool?
Yeah, let me answer the second first. My email should be in the slides. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to give you a demo of the tool. We will ask that you sign an NDA because there is a lot of customer data in there. But we are welcome to work with any NGOs and cities on providing this data. Frankly, as the utility, we're not the best about getting out there and convincing these customers to do it. So anytime someone wants to see the tool, that's an ally in getting these technologies out there. So just email me and we'll get you set up. Obligation to serve. I think this is there's a little bit of legal gray area, I would say, in terms of, how it is interpreted. I would say in California, at least, it's been a very conservative interpretation where it is really sort of fuel specific. So if a customer requests gas, we have to provide them gas. My understanding is that sort of differs across the US in terms of how folks are sort of thinking about that. And I will say, on the flip side, there are some gas utilities that are starting to think about, can we provide like hydrogen or RNG and still meet gas if we have to serve gas. So there's a lot of really interesting nuance to that question that frankly is above my pay grade. But yeah, happy to compare notes with folks.
Thank you. And as mentioned in the chat, BDC is going to be releasing a long form report on obligation to serve reform happening around the country, how different states interpret it, use it, and what are reform options that are being explored in states across the United States. So please do subscribe to our newsletter and follow our website for updates on that. I want to thank our panelists, Rachel and Jared, your two leaders in this space. Thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you for all the attendees for this. As you can see from the chat and the Q&A, there's an incredible amount of excitement, but also questions that need to be answered for us to be moving forward on this. We will be emailing out the slides, the notes, the answers to the questions if you're registered. So please do register for this webinar. And please do join us for future webinars. Join the coalition and join us for our in-person events like the March 6th Thermal Energy Network meeting in Albany. Thank you all very much for everything you all do for building decarbonization in your communities. And we look forward to seeing you out there in the building decarbonization space. Thank you all. We're going to close down the meeting now.